We can see your screen.
One second. Okay. I'm going to be working a little bit on first of all, good morning, everyone.
Oh, could you make the print larger, please?
Yes. How's that? Okay. That good?
Better.
Yeah.
Can you make it even larger? So basically what I'm working on two computers, so I'm going to be probably a little bit awkward here. For some reason, the computer that I'm talking to you from is not allowing me to share the screen. So I opened up another account, and that's why my daughter's account, Hadar Susman, is sharing the screen with you, and I'm working off the two computers simultaneously. And since I can't chew gum and walk at the same time, so it will be a little bit, perhaps, might not work as smoothly as I would like. And you're going to see the side of my head every now and then. Okay, but I think that we'll be able to manage. What I'd like to talk to you about today, even though normally speaking, the shiur is called Parashu HaShavua, we normally speak about halachic topics that when we are that touch upon the parsha, but every now and then I think that it's important to also talk about major philosophical issues that and not just the halachic issues. And this is certainly one of those cases, because not only in terms of Parshat Vayechi in particular, but in terms of the second half of Sefer Bereshit as a whole, the entire story of Yosef, the Torah tells us time and time again, Yosef here in our Parsha, just to speak about it here in source number 5, if you take a look at it, though he had already said it in last week's Parsha. Well, we'll take a look at both of these, both of the Psukim. So here 2 weeks ago, last week, Yosef had said, Va'ata, number 4, Ata, atem shlachtem oti hena, ki ha'elokim. Right? You did not send me here. God sent me here. Vayisimeni la'av lefaro la'adon l'chol beito u'moshel b'chol eretz Mitzrayim. And God placed me as this father figure for Paro, the master on all his house, and to make me a ruler in all of Eretz Mitzrayim. This is repeated in in a slightly different way at the very end of the Sefer, at the very end of the Torah, where after Yaakov has passed away and the brothers are concerned that Yosef may be holding a grudge after all of these years, and that he's waited for the 17 years for Yaakov to pass away, but now that Yaakov is no longer on the scene, that he's going to wreak revenge with the brothers, and the brothers come to Yosef, but just as an aside, just want to point out that we'd like to think of the story as having a happy ending, and they all lived happily ever after. But this is indicative that, at least at this point, and it could very well be that it continued afterwards, the rift between the brothers is never totally healed. But the brothers, if they are concerned that Yosef might be ready for revenge 17 years in, so that means that the type of loving relationship that we would like to think that they had probably hasn't materialized, and that there is still some concern clearly on the brother's side. But Yosef's response is very telling. He says, "Vayomer aleihem Yosef al tirau." Don't be afraid. Ki atachat Elokim ani, right? Because am I? This might be a.
I just have one thing.
I am.
Why would not, in the introductory sentence, lav
Sorry.
לא, אני סגרתי את זה, זה בסדר.
Okay. Just to see, someone sent it me in the chat. No, I did not. Okay. So getting back to the second pasuk, the atem chashavtem alai ra'a. It's here in source number 5. Elokim chashava l'tov, tova l'man aso kayom hazeh lahachayot am ra. God thought for the better in order to have a large multitude today. The things have shifted a little bit. I didn't put it on the sheet, but the rationale back in Parshat Vayigash wasn't that there be a great multitude as there is today, 17 years later. But at the time, it was simply for them to be able to survive the famine. Now, Yosef has a different perspective because the Jews have settled into Mitzrayim. They're not going anywhere. So now the goal of God, as it were, trying to decide what the divine providence was, is that Yosef, there be a large people living in Eretz Mitzrayim. We, of course, know what Yosef doesn't know, and that is that the purpose would seem to be to fulfill the Brit Ben HaBitarim, what God had told Avraham, that you're going to have 4 generations that are going to be living outside of Eretz Israel, and only the 4th generation is going to return, and that has to happen because of Yaakov going down to Mitzrayim. This is not on Yosef's mind because, of course, Yosef doesn't know that part of the plan. We, looking back more than 3,000 years later, know that part of the plan, but Yosef doesn't know that plan. So when we're talking about hashgacha, basically the topic of the shir today. So it's also important to keep that in mind. And even when we try to look and to retroactively try to understand what is God's purpose in moving things forward, we should be humble in our assumptions, because it could very well be that the intervention, the intent is for something which is going to happen far in the future, and that we aren't privy to at all. That we'll now take a look at what goes on in the story throughout, and how this might, how this falls out, and what does the Yosef story tell us about Hashgacha Pratit, and then also what I'd like to take beyond that is to look at the second half of the shir. Really, the bulk of the shir will be devoted to different approaches, both of the Rishonim and in the Achronim, as to what extent do we expect there to be Hashgacha Pratit? Is everything that happens, that everything that we do, everything that occurs to us, everything that happens in the world, is it because of a divine plan, or do we assume that God put certain things into motion in Sheshet Yimei Ma'aseh Bereshit, that when God created the world, created the universe, so there were laws that were put into effect. Human beings are part of that overall structure. And God doesn't get involved on a day-to-day, minute-by-minute, second-to-second basis. If that's the case, exactly when does he get involved, and how can we expect him to be involved? So all of these questions are obviously very, very important questions in terms of just trying to understand the role that we expect the be playing in the world. So this is hopefully what we'll be talking about throughout this year. So I'd like to, with that in mind, let's take a step back, go to the beginning of the story, and see whether or not the plan, what Yosef calls the plan, is something which is expected to happen. It's going to happen no matter what, or it's something that people have to be involved in. And here I want to focus on one particular incident. It's back in Parshat Vayeshev at the very beginning of the story, here in number 1, where Hashgacha Pratit becomes a major feature of the story. Yosef is sent from Hebron to Shechem to find his brothers. And the Torah tells us that he doesn't find them in Shechem where he expects to find them. And a person, a man, vayimtza'eu ish toeh basadeh, vayishaleu ha'ish lemor ma tevakesh. Right? An unknown, an anonymous individual finds him wandering in the field, and he asks him, "What are you looking for?" Ma tevakesh. Right? And this is this person who the Torah doesn't tell us who it is. Rashi, quoting the Medrash, says that other than a malach, it's Gabriel. The God, in effect, sends a malach to make sure that Yosef finds his brothers, and he will guide him to the right place. Now, if you think about the story itself, it's a really very strange incident that occurs. And it's clear that the Torah is trying to tell us something about the story by relaying this incident. You know, we, as you all probably know, from the walk from Shechem, from Hebron to Shechem is not a short walk. It's going to take someone at least 2 to 3 days to make it on foot from Hebron to Shechem. And that and of course nothing that of that incident of those 3 days is told to us, because it's not particularly important to us to know, you know, what did Yosef eat for breakfast? What hotel did he stay in? Who did he speak to? Presumably he spoke to several people, maybe even many people along the way as he walked from Hebron on to get to Shechem. None of that's important. The Torah could have told us that he came, even if the Torah wanted to tell us that he went to Shechem and he didn't find the brothers. He could have said that he continued on to Dotan. He didn't find the brothers in Shechem and he went on to Dotan. Why does the Torah have to tell us about the fact that he meets this individual and the person tells us what it is? And I've always, when I've viewed this story, and everyone, you know, I think, you know, has to take from their own youth what their vision of a cracker is, I guess, for lack of a better term. Because I've always viewed this person, right, as basically being a person who's pumping gasoline. Right? There's suddenly a gasoline station, the gas station appears out of nowhere in Shechem, and Yosef is looking for directions. So he goes into the person and to the person, the attendant at the gas station, and you know, as I said, in my mind, he's has a big piece of hay in his in his teeth. Maybe he's chewing tobacco, and he says, he goes, "Oh yeah, I saw those brothers, right?" And it was there's a disconnect in terms of how does he get there and what's he doing. And he tells this person, "Et achai anochi mevakesh, hagidan ali eifo hem roim," and the person says, "Nasu mizeh," right? Of course, this person out of nowhere knows exactly who Yosef is referring to, a total stranger, and he knows exactly who Yosef is referring to. He knows that they've gone to Dotan because the brothers came to the exact same gas station to get directions. And now Yosef goes and he finds them in Dotan. So you can understand why the Medrash is saying that this is an angel. This is not in the sense of there being, and now the Ramban takes this one step further, and he says that when this idea is that here in the last line, we're going to come back to the line right before it, but lo nitkavnu rabotenu bazeh. Look what the Ramban says. Lo nitkavnu rabotenu ba'omram ki ha'ishim ha'elahem malachim. Right, this is what the Chazal say, that these people are angels. Shelo al chinam hayah l'sipur hazeh lahodienu ki atzat Hashem hitakum. The Ramban says you can look at this person as being the angel Gabriel, or you can look at this person as being just anybody who is in the right place at the right time because God wants him to be there. And this is how Yosef is going to go to Dotan. That's what it means to be a malach here. It means that God is pulling the strings in order to make sure that Yosef finds his way to the brothers, so that the brothers will sell him, so that he'll get down to Egypt and he'll be there at the right time for the famine to get the family down, and then Sipur Yetziat Mitzrayim will happen as a result. All of this is being done because the people are puppets and God is the puppeteer. And if that's the case, so then you have to add, this of course opens up all sorts of questions in terms of the brothers' actions, in terms of their culpability, in terms of their bechira chofshit. What happens if the brothers say they don't want to sell him? What happens if the brothers decide, God forbid, to kill him? What happens if if Ruvain is successful and saves Yosef? All of those options should be on the table, and yet are they really on the table if this is the angel? But the Ramban says something a little bit earlier, which I think is very, very important here, because the Ramban says that with regard to the everything that's going on in terms of Yaakov sending Yosef onto to meet the brothers by Yishlacheu. So the Ramban says that lahagid ki Yosef l'chvod aviv nitametz lalechet achreihem el makom rachok v'lo amar eich elech v'hem sonim oti. Right? So this is very important. He's saying that basically there is a very important human component. Yosef throughout has to make the right moves. And when I say the right moves, I mean the morally correct moves. Yosef could very easily have found an excuse not to go from Hebron to Shechem. It's a very long trip. There is no clear reason as to why he's being sent there in the first place. Yosef could have opted out. He could have found an excuse. He's a 17-year-old, right? We all know what teenagers can do. They can find good excuses or bad excuses for not doing things. Yosef could have found the excuse why he did not want to go. And the Ramban says Yosef nevertheless did this because he is Yosef. In other words, he has this sense of kibud av. If he doesn't have the sense of kibud av, the story isn't going to unfold. Similarly, once he makes it to Dotan, so he could have turned back at that point. But the Ramban continues and says, "Aval hakol saval," right? That lichvod aviv. He did all of this in order to he persevered because he wanted to honor his father. So the storyline itself is creating a type of merge between, on the one hand, the as important as it is, the divine plan, but the divine intervention, if you will. God is not the puppeteer, but he's the producer of the show. And the people on the stage, ultimately, it might be the director, but ultimately, the people on the stage are the ones who are going to read the lines. And they're going to decide if they're going to read the scripted lines or they're going to read ad-lib lines. That is where if if you will, the nexus between the Bechira Chofshit of the individuals who are on the stage, together with the divine initiative. So just to perhaps highlight this, I want to go to a famous story where which makes it all the way into Koasu Chachamenu. It's a children's story here in Israel, but it's a very deep story, and it's called the story of Yosef Mokir Shabbat, the story of Joseph who honors the Sabbath, and it's a Gemara in Shabbat and Daf Kuf Yutet. And I'm just going to actually look at it from on the English side, because I want to get into, as I said, into the more philosophical issues in terms of the way that different thinkers have dealt with the question of hashgacha pratit throughout the centuries. But I just want to take a look at this particular story. So the story is, I think, pretty well known. It's a story of a person who's known as Yosef Mokir Shabbat, Yosef who honors the Sabbath. That was his nickname, and that's going to be important that was his nickname. And in his in the vicinity where he lived, in his neighborhood, there was a certain Gentile. I'm just going to read it from the English, who owned much property. Soothsayers told him, Joseph, who honors the Sabbath, will consume all your property. So he went, sold all his property, bought a precious stone with the proceeds, which he set in his turban. So basically, you have a situation where you have this non-Jew who wants to do everything in his power to protect his wealth. He's been told by the astrologers that he's going to lose all his wealth to this Yosef Mokir Shabbat, and he doesn't want that to happen. So he sells everything, buys this one jewel. It's on in his hat. It's something that no one is ever going to get to. And he crosses the bridge. The wind blows it off. It goes into the river, and it's a scene from Bavel, right? Because here we don't have rivers like that, but in Bavel there are many of them. And the fish swallows it. He loses the hat. The fish, a few days later, is fished out of the river. It's brought to the marketplace close to Erev Shabbat, and nobody is going to buy this fish. Apparently, it's really an incredible fish, but it's going to go to waste, or it will not be sold to a Jew. And someone says, "Oh, go to Yosef Makir Shabbat. Everybody else is prepared for Shabbat. He's also prepared for Shabbat, but he take this." Fish, and it's important enough. Yosef buys it for a ridiculously high sum of money because he wants the fish, I'm sorry, not a ridiculously. He just buys it, and then when he is cleaning the fish to prepare it for Shabbat, he finds the jewel, and he's able to sell the jewel for a ridiculously large sum of money. And then the story, and this is why it's brought in the Gemara, is because Yosef had always honored the Shabbat, so now the Shabbat honors him. He gets repaid for all of the investment that he did throughout, his lifetime in terms of this. Now, forgetting about the Shabbat for a second, what can you see about Hashgacha from this story? What do you see from the perspective of the non-Jew? What do you see from the perspective of the Jew? Or I shouldn't say from the Jew, from our perspective. So from the perspective of the non-Jew, so once he hears that Yosef has the jewel, so he probably thinks that there is no escaping fate. So the very act that he had taken in order to prevent fate from being played out is exactly the act that is the catalyst for the wealth to be transferred to Yosef. So you could look at the story and say, it's fate, it's hashgacha, there is nothing that you can do to avoid it. Everything that you do to avoid it will only bring you closer to that scene. That is one way of reading the story, and there are similar, I guess, folk tales where that is the in other cultures where that is the idea. Meeting death in Baghdad is one of those types of stories that you go and you that because you try to avoid something, that's exactly where your fate is waiting for you. But that is not the message of this story. In this story, it's only because it's Yosef who honors the Shabbat, Yosef Makir Shabbat, who is known to everybody by that moniker. In other words, if the message of the story had been there is hashgacha pratit, and you can't do hashgacha pratit, whether you want to call it fate or you want to call it divine providence, it's something that you cannot avoid. It's something that's going to get you. So then we don't have to know about Yosef Makir Shabbat. We could just know that, this is what happened to a Jew. And that would have been fine, right? It was that this is what God intends and God wants to reward. The message of the story, I think, is that it's only because Yosef had done this Yosef had done so many things throughout his life for Shabbat that he's known by the fish sellers, the fishmongers in the shuk on Erev Shabbat, that he's the only person who's going to buy the fish. That's why the story happens. If Yosef hasn't done all of these things throughout many years without any expectation of reward, or even with expectation of reward, but if it's only because of his actions that the play, if you will, can play out. Otherwise, it wouldn't have happened. The same thing holds true in terms of our Yosef story. It's only because Yosef is willing to go up to Shechem and leave Hebron, even though he doesn't have to. It's only because he's willing to search out in Dotan. It's only because he is going to say no to Eshet Potiphar, even though that might not have been the best pragmatic choice. It's only because Yosef is making moral decisions at the expense of the pragmatic decisions. So that's the only reason that the hashgacha pratit is able to work out. And you can make that argument about many of the other layers of the story and layers of many stories. So if you're talking about hashgacha, so you could say, yes, there is a divine plan, but the bechira of the individuals leading up is a very important component to allow the plan to happen. And if let's say the brothers had chosen not to sell Yosef, if they had made that kind of decision, if Reuven had won the day, so I think that it is it's quite possible that the Jews might not have made it to Egypt, and the Brit Ben Abtarim would have happened in some other way. But that's something which is important to keep in mind. It's not just that God has his plan and man plans and God laughs. That's not the only aspect of the story. That could be part of the story. That could be part of what goes on in terms of the non-Jew, if you will, in this particular story. He plans, and God had other intentions. That also is part two of the equation. But it's also that God plans, and man, I don't know about man laughing, but man can certainly make his own plans, and God has to rewrite the script then because of those plans. So that's something which I think is important to keep in mind. Now I'd like to switch to a more philosophical discussion of it, though I guess what just said now is also pretty philosophical, and talk about from in the next 40 minutes or so, to talk about different approaches to understanding divine providence on a more philosophical level. The first is the approach of the Rambam. And the Rambam talks about this in several places. I've taken two pieces from the Moreh Nevuchim, from the guide, for two reasons, I've brought it into English. One is that it's going to allow us to move a little bit faster. Also, because, and this is just something that something to think about, when things are translated, and the Moreh Nevuchim was written in Arabic, so it could very well be that the best translation isn't necessarily the Hebrew translation. So the translation here is that I was working off of is the English translation, which for our purposes is a better translation. In any event, here we go. So there are two pieces that we're going to look at. Chelek Gimel, the third section, chapter 17, and chapter 51. In 17, he says the following: my opinion on this principle of divine providence, I will now explain to you. In the lower or sublunary portion of the universe, meaning our world, divine providence does not extend to the individual members of species except in the case of mankind. So this is something that the Rambam makes very explicit, right? That when we talk about hashgacha pratit, the only species that can be expected on a hashgacha pratit, an individual level, is our people, right? Human beings. It's only in this species that the incidence and the existence of the individual beings, their good and evil fortunes, are the results of justice in accordance with the words, for all his ways, Kichol Drachav Mishpat, all his ways are judgment. Now, I agree with Aristotle as regards all other living beings, and a fortiori as regarding plants and all the rest of earthly creatures. Now, basically, Aristotle was of the belief that God doesn't get involved at all in this world. God can't be of this world from that philosophical perspective. Our world is a world of change. God is by definition, someone who is never changing, and any involvement in our world would mean that there is some kind of change in God. So therefore, Aristotle felt that there really wasn't any room, philosophically speaking, for divine intervention in this world. The Rambam can't accept that because that would go against the Torah. And so the Rambam believes in hashgacha pratit, but he is willing to accept that with regard to all other species, everything else going on in the world, the natural order of the, if you will, of the universe as a whole. So there isn't any direct divine intervention. And now he explains this in more detail. Now, just to skip to the bold, it is not by a particular divine decree that the spittle of a certain person moved, fell on a certain gnat in a certain place and killed it, nor it is by the direct will of God that a certain fish catches and swallows a certain worm on the surface of the water. In all these cases, the action is, according to my opinion, entirely due to chance, as taught by Aristotle. Divine providence is connected with divine. So that's the idea. In other words, Freddy the Frog, if you will, is not being looked after by God. The Rambam is of the belief that, as were many medieval thinkers, that the world, and this is different than the modern way of looking at it, that the world is as the way it was and the way it will always be, not in terms of human actions, but in terms of the natural order. So, for example, the whole notion of species extinction was something that was not known to medieval thinkers. as they assumed that the species as a whole would always exist the way that they were created at the beginning of time. That is so there are always going to be the same lions on the savannah and the same gorillas in the jungle and the same wild ox that are living in the fields of Europe. These are that's the way that God made the world. So individual members of those species, things might go well for them, things might go poorly for them. That's just part of the natural order as it was put into motion. But the species as a whole, right, is always going to be there. So the Freddy the Frog may live a great life, or Freddy the Frog might be swallowed by a snake. But there will always be frogs, and there will always be snakes, and all of the different species and subspecies are going to continue the way that they are. So that's if you will, with regard to the rest of the world. However, with regard to people, so why should we be involved in this at all? Or why should we be different, excuse me, at all? So here, he says the following: divine providence is connected with divine intellectual influence. Okay, so this is where things change. Things change because for people, because we are sentient beings, and since we're sentient beings, and since we can comprehend God, so now there's room for an interaction between God and man. And now we can be held culpable for our actions, right? That was the line that he quoted before. Kol drachav mishpat, all his ways are judgment. In order for his actions to be mishpat, to be din, so then there has to be a being which is being judged, and that's the human being. So therefore, right, the same action might be viewed differently depending on how it is impacting human beings. And he gives the following example: however, for example, and this, with the events of this past week in Kentucky, so it is perhaps especially poignant. He says the following: it may be mere chance that a ship goes down with all her contents, or in the above mentioned instance, the roof, or as in the above instance, the roof of the house falls on those within. That incident, that is a certain house being leveled by a tornado. So that happens to be because the patterns, and the house was built in the wrong place at the wrong time. However, he says, but it is not due to chance, according to our view, that in the one instance the men went into the ship or remained in the house, or in the other incident, or in the other instance. In other words, it's not chance that a particular house is occupied at that moment. That, he says, it is due to the will of God. There we have, when it comes to human beings, so there, that is something, the house being leveled, that's not necessarily going to be something which is divinely ordained at that particular moment, but the person being inside will be. Now, there has to be this isn't, so neat and clean, if you think about it, because, well, what if the person's, a person loses everything? They themselves weren't in the house, they were saved. But all of their wealth was in that house. Right? They'd invested. Now the house is gone. So, and they don't have insurance. So is that part the will of God? Or is everything that impacts on the person? Presumably it is. So there is exactly how if God didn't want that person to lose his wealth, so then should the tornado have done a little bit of a detour around the house? Should that be the one house that's left standing? Perhaps, I'd say you have to ask all of these, every single aspect of the way that it's going to be impacting on the individual. So then presumably that's where the divine providence works in. The Rambam has limited it to human beings, but since things that occur around us are impacting on us, so and we're impacting on them, right? Especially as we mentioned at the beginning of this year. So then all of this seems to how this is all going to work out is going to be needs to be further explored. Now the Rambam himself.
Can I ask a question on that?
Sure.
Okay. This seems to be a problematic circular argument, because the fact that somebody is in the house, there's no importance to that other than the fact that there's going to be a tornado or that the roof of the house is going to collapse. In other words, there's no need for God to will that somebody be in the house or out of the house unless it's already known that there's going to be something potentially dangerous that's going to occur. You follow what I'm saying? That
right.
Why would God care whether somebody's in a house or on a daily basis? He only cares because he knows that there's something bad going to happen. So now he either puts the person in the house or out of the house. So it's all kind of circular. I think it's the way the Rambam has formulated this is extremely problematic.
Okay. So what I would respond for the Rambam is that the Rambam wouldn't argue with you, except he might tell you that it's not a bad argument and that it's not circular. But in the sense that there's another aspect that you're taking into account, which I don't think that the Rambam would think is a problem, but it's a different problem. Maybe we'll talk about this in a couple of weeks, but it's the question of God's foreknowledge of events, and perhaps the interaction with Bechira Chofshit. But the fact that God knows the tornado is going to hit, that is true. And the Rambam would agree with you. The question of whether the person should be in the house or not, so that the Rambam would say is that, if the person wasn't there at all, this was a person who was supposed to be saved, and the person never showed up to the house, so God wouldn't get involved. But if the person shows up to the house and he doesn't deserve to be killed at this moment, so then God will arrange for him to be out of the house. Do you follow?
Correct, I follow. I think it's still.
In other words, it's true. God knows. In other words, and that's another problem, another major issue, which I don't want to get into. But how can we work God's knowledge of every given moment with our ability to impact on it, and with our ability to make decisions and to be free agents?
No, I'm not suggesting that there's a clear philosophical answer to any of these questions. So
right. No, so all I'm trying to say is that but that's a separate problem. Was the Rambam would tell you, yes, God knows what's going to happen, and he also, you pretend that you're God, right? You see the events unfolding, and you want to now, right? You see somebody, you know that the tornado is coming down because you've been you're watching the radar, and you see your neighbor going into his house, and you know that the tornado is going to be hitting there in a minute. Right? So you pick up the phone and you call him and say, "Get out of the house, the tornado is about to hit." Or you don't pick up the phone and you let the tornado hit. So in the first case, so it's God not getting involved. In the second case, it's God picking up the phone. Right? That's basically what the Rambam says. But the Rambam says that God wouldn't pick up the phone to get the dogs out of the house. But God will pick up the phone to get people out of the house.
Okay.
Okay, that's the way the Rambam says. Now, in a little bit later in 51, so the Rambam now basically says that he limits this to a specific group of individuals. But basically, the Rambam says that this is not, was God's divine providence is not something which necessarily every single human being should expect at any given moment. Rambam says the following, that he's speaking specifically about the Avot, and he says the patriarchs likewise tend to attain this degree of perfection. They approach God in such a manner that with them the name of God became known in the world. Thus we read in scripture, the God of Abraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov, this is my name forever. Their mind was so identified with the knowledge of God that he made a lasting covenant with them. Then will I remember my covenant with Jacob. When we therefore find them also engaged. So basically what the Rambam is saying the following is that, why is it that God is willing to get involved, right? Why is God willing to pick up the phone, as it were? So from the Rambam's perspective, it's not so much that God picks up the phone, but that the question is whether God is, if you will, is transmitting all the time. And it's a question whether you're able to pick up the transmission. But the impact, I'm going to use a metaphor that I once heard from Rabbi Lichtenstein Zatzal, and this is the metaphor that the Rambam himself could not have thought of. And you'll understand what I mean in a moment. Basically, the Rambam would compare the Ribono Shel Olam to the sun, and people to planets. And the question is, so basically, we're all in our orbits around God, and based on wherever our orbit is, that's the amount of impact that the divine presence is going to, and the divine providence is going to have on us. So a person, and this is what he means by the avot, when we're talking about attaining this degree of perfection. When the avot are tuned into the Ribono Shel Olam, they are the equivalent, if you will, of Mercury. As they basically move themselves into an orbit which is so close to the Ribono Shel Olam that they are constantly feeling the impact of the Ribono Shel Olam. Other individuals aren't Mercury, maybe they're Pluto, right? They're held in the overall orbit, the pull. They're there, but they barely feel the providence. Things go on as normal for them without God being involved. And that's basically what how the Rambam is understanding Hashgacha Pratit. Hashgacha Pratit becomes a question of which orbit are you and I putting ourselves in. And the closer we get to to Shel Olam, which for the Rambam is a question of intellectual perfection. So, which is what he says here in the middle. those who are perfect in their perception of God, whose mind is never separated from him. Right? How do I get myself into a close orbit? So then they are the ones who are constantly thinking of God, constantly perhaps contemplating God. For the Rambam on a philosophical level, for others, it could be on a moral level, it could be in terms of kiyum Torah and mitzvot. In other words, whatever your yardstick is, that's of human perfection and of dveikut b'Hashem. That's what is going to give you a higher level of hashgacha pratit. And then the Rambam says something which is very interesting in this regard. Those, right, who perfect in their knowledge of God, turn their minds sometimes away from God, enjoy the presence of divine providence only when they meditate on God. In other words, I didn't read it inside because of the time, but basically what he says about the Avod is that they never had Hesech Hadat. They never are not thinking of the Ribono Shlom. God is always somewhere in the back of their minds. And that's why they have continual Hashgacha Pratit, continual divine providence. Other people, on the other hand, the rest of us will say, sometimes we're closer to God, sometimes we're further away. It's not a question, even orbits could be understood in this type of metaphor because they're not perfectly circular, they're elliptical. So you can have sometimes we're at apogee, so sometimes we're farther away. Whereas basically, even in a regular orbit, you have times that you're closer and further away from the sun. But we can also be comets, whereas we can have at certain times places that we zip really very, very close, and other times where we go into the as far away in the outer recesses of the outer recesses of the solar system as possible. And everywhere in between. But it's totally dependent on us. God never is moving. In other words, the hashgacha that he's giving is because of, and this is a problem with the Rambam, is that it doesn't allow God to be the part of divine hashgacha pratit that we mentioned before, that man plans and God laughs. That isn't going to happen because it's going to always be based on what people do. It's never really, it's hard to understand. The Rambam tries to square the circle, but it doesn't, it's a little bit hard to do. How does God get involved if God is if you will, he's the sun, and this question of where we are putting our own orbits. So that's a little bit of a difficulty which needs to be worked out. Okay, so that's with regard to the Rambam. Now, a very similar, I shouldn't say very similar, a similar approach is found in the Ramban, but he phrases it a little differently. I'm going to go to a Ramban, which is a little less well known, and here you're going to see perhaps the difference in trying to understand it. You know what? Before I get to that, we'll do the Ramban, where the Ramban says the following. Let's start with number 9. Ramban says, with regard to it's as part of the Tochacha at the end of Sefer Vayikra, where the pasuk says, "Kol machala asher samti b'Mitzrayim lo asim alecha ki ani Hashem rofecha." Whatever plagues befell the Egyptians will not befall you, because I am God, your healer. And this is where the Ramban takes a a stand with regard to his view of medicine. And the Ramban says the following: Hadoresh Hashem bin Navi lo yidrosh berofim. The Rambam had said in different places, the Rambam basically said that medicine is something that we should all be searching out, and that when it comes to healing ourselves or preventing disease, so we should be following our doctor's advice. That's basically the Rambam's position. It's something that we can talk about at much greater length at some other time. The Ramban, on the other hand, seems to say that medicine is not really necessary, because after all, what's the point of medical intervention? If God wants you to be well, you'll be well, and if God wants you, Rahman al-Islam, not to be well, you won't be well. So what's the point of going to a doctor in the first place? So the Ramban says that seems to say that that's the case. Doresh Hashem bin Navi lo yidrosh birofim. Person who is searching out for God will not. You'll go to a prophet. You won't go to a doctor. Then he says something very strong. Ma chelek l'rofim. The physicians in the audience, please don't take offense. Ma chelek l'rofim beveit osei ritzon Hashem. What role do doctors have in the house of someone who follows the divine will? And then he explains exactly what I just said a moment ago. If God has promised to bless your food, your water, if you're doing the right thing, so then what is working with acting properly? So keeping an eye on your cholesterol. So why should you bother doing that? You're not going to get a heart attack. And if you are, and if you're about to be punished, so you'll get the heart attack, even if you are a marathon runner and you're in the best of shape. So what's the point? So then, and yet the Ramban knows that we have a chiyuv to go to rofim, we have a chiyuv to go for medicine, and the Torah tells us nitan reshut l'rofim l'rapot, that God has given us the permission to turn for medical intervention. So the Ramban says, ilu lo haya darkam b'refuot yachla adam k'fi asher yiyeh alav onesh cheto v'yitrapeh b'ratzon Hashem aval heim nagu b'refuot v'Hashem hinicham l'mikrei tivam. So here is what the Ramban says, that if we were perfect in terms of our in terms of what we're supposed to be doing, so then really we would always be, you could tell a person's spiritual health based on their physical health, and everything would be totally based on divine intervention. But this line that Heim nahagu b'refuot Hashem inicham l'mikrei atzva'im, they chose medication, they chose medical science, therefore God left them to natural happenstance. That's the way that the Ramban is phrasing it. Now the Ramban is actually going to, in his piece in Eov, which is not, the Ramban talks about divine intervention. Could have had a shir just on the Ramban's approach to divine intervention. He speaks about it to the best of my knowledge in close to a dozen different places. He makes different references to it. And the Ramban is clearly of the belief that God gets involved, and sometimes he's even quoted as being that that there is no such thing as evidence. That the Ramban and the Ramban is the person who makes that case strongly, but that's not totally the case. Basically, what the Ramban is saying is that very similar to the Rambam in this regard, that God only gets involved with the people with whom you are having with whom those people that have chosen to be involved with God. Right? That line that I quoted before, right? Just to look at it again, that if they chose the world of medicine, God left them to natural happenstance. In other words, because we are part of a natural order, and that natural order is there. So we have to lift ourselves out of the natural order, and we can do that, but it's something that is for specific individuals, not for the bulk of humanity. So I'm not going to go to the Ramban and Eov because it's going to take us a little bit too long. So I will take a look at number 11 here, the Ramban in Sefer Dvarim. And the Ramban says, Vida, the last two lines here, Da ki hanisim lo yasu l'tova o l'ra'a rak l'tzadikim gmurim o l'rishayim. Aval ha'beinonim kederech haminhago shel olam ya'aseh behem tova o ra'a kedarkam uchalilotam. So the Ramban divides the world into three groups. There are the tzadikim gemurim, there are the rishayim gemurim, the two poles, if you will, and then there's the great unwashed masses in the middle. So the people on either pole are people that God is going to be actively involved with, either to reward in some way or to punish in some way. The Beinonim, which is the bulk of us, so the Beinonim, so then it's Kederach Minhago Shel Olam Ya'aseh Bahem. And here is an important distinction between him and the Rambam. It's the equivalent, let's take what Harold said before, take that case. So it's if you see the tornado bearing down on this house, so you can get the people out, or for that matter, you can get people in. If you want to punish them, you can call someone else and say, oh, get to that house very quickly if you want to be saved, even though you know that that's going to be their end, right? You can bring people into that or home, or you can get people out of that home. Or you can choose, and here's the important word, to choose, not to do anything. Whereas you can allow things to play themselves out. That is the third choice, and that's basically what the Ramban claims is happening when we aren't being impacted directly by Hashgacha Pratit. What's basically what happens is that God is making a conscious decision not to get involved. His involvement is by his decision not to be involved. That's different than the Rambam. In the Rambam's way of viewing it, it was that there was the natural order, and we're all part of the natural order, unless we do things that allow us to be removed from the natural order. In the Ramban's view of it, there's the natural order, but the natural order itself is being, as well, supported by God's decisions, and our being left to the natural order is, and once that happens, by the way, so then it's very important for us to be eating the right foods, and it's very important for us to be getting our exercise, because we can't expect God to save us if we don't. But in that natural order, it's because God has decided to leave us to the natural order. We're just because God is uninvolved, as it were, in the natural order. So the Ramban, in this piece, it's actually I found very fascinating, is that the Ramban, in the piece that I didn't read in Eov, so you can look at it later, the Ramban actually quotes the Rambam as his source. he says that the Inyan Hazeh Biur Harav Biur Yafeh B'Moreh Nevuchim. Right? He's referring to the Rambam that we read, and it's very similar in terms of the structure. It's again the same thing holds true. The Rambam and the Ramban on a bottom line level. Will God get involved with people? It really depends on who those people are, right? That's the same in the Rambam and the Ramban, but the mechanism, if you will, is very different between the Rambam and the Ramban. In the last couple of minutes, we started a few minutes late, so I just want to take advantage and I'm just going to mention it in really very much in very briefly. There is the approach that I just mentioned, the Rambam approach, the Ramban approach, is the primary approach, if you will, in Jewish philosophy. There are many different variations on the theme. When I talk about variations on the theme, the question might be, who is the elect, if you will, that are going to be the beneficiaries of this divine intervention? Is it individual tzaddikim and chasidim, the way that the Rambam and the Ramban say it? Is it Am Yisrael as a whole? What is the tools that stand for us to be able to gain that hashgacha pratit, to gain that divine providence? Is it doing mitzvot? Is it contemplating God the way the Rambam says? In other words, there are different variations, but the basic idea that you have a natural order, and that natural order impacts on everything else in the universe except for human beings. That is what is common to all of these approaches. Then the question is, how can human beings be different? How can we be beneficiaries of hashgacha pratit? And are we always beneficiaries of hashgacha pratit? So that is, as I said, that seems to be really very much the mainstream approach in Jewish philosophy with regard to the question of hashgacha pratit. We have the ability to be beneficiaries of hashgacha pratit, but it's not a given. And there are going to be many instances, perhaps even most instances, for most people, where we are not beneficiaries of hashgacha pratit, but we are, as part of the physical world, as everyone else. This is with regard to that first approach. There is an approach which really becomes, in many ways, more popular in the last couple of hundred years. It is the approach which I don't know if it begins with, but is certainly made popular in the Hasidic movement. And because there is an advantage and a disadvantage. The advantage of the approach that we've been talking about until now is that you can't look at everything that happens to you and ask yourself, where is God? Why is this happening? Because it could be that there are times that things happen, good things and bad things. And as I might win the lottery, or God forbid, someone might have cancer. It's all part of being part of the natural order. And expecting, you can't ever expect hashgacha pratit, but you can work hard and earn hashgacha pratit, and hopefully gain hashgacha pratit. So that's an advantage, but there's a disadvantage to it. The disadvantage is that, at least to my thinking, is that it means that you feel a certain distance from God, because the world is going on around us, and maybe the Ribono Shel Olam is involved with me, and maybe the Ribono Shel Olam isn't involved with me. I'm not deserving of God's intervention. That is not necessarily a very good feeling to have. In the opposite approach, and this is, I took a piece, you'll see hopefully why in just 1 second. I took a later approach, and this is it's 3 simanim in his Tshuvot, Rav Menashe Klein, the Mishneh Halachot. He was a Hungarian Hasidic figure, a survivor of the Shoah, and who went first to Brooklyn. He became he was a Hasid, a Kloisenberger Hasid. Anyway, he wrote a very influential posek. He wrote, I think, 17 volumes of Tshuvot. This was a Tshuva taken from 1976, and I think it's even more apropos now. And he is dealing with the different hashkachot, and he quotes one of the proponents of we'll call the Maimonidean, Nachmanidean school, a Talmud of the Ramban, the Sefer HaChinuch. And the Sefer HaChinuch says that it's inconceivable that he said there are those groups, to say it outside, and then I'll take a look at one or two lines inside, that basically he says it's inconceivable that God will be involved in every single detail. There's just so many details going on that this is something, he says, the rachok min hasechel, right? This is just something which our common sense can't possibly accept and comprehend. The Mishneh Halachot, so he disagrees with that assertion. He says that it can be, and as I said, this is something that already began with the Baal Shem Tov, and maybe at another time we'll look at the different Hasidic approaches. I've been talking about the approaches before Hasidut, but the idea that starts with the Baal Shem Tov, that God is involved with every single blade of grass, to use the medrash that they take off of. That the last line on the sheet, Davar zeh mufurash b'Chazal. This is the explicit in Chazal in the Medrash Rabbah, that ein lecha kol esev ve'esev milamata she'en mazal milamala shemakeh oto ve'omer lo gadel. There isn't a single blade of grass in this world that there isn't some kind of influence from above that impacts on it and says, grow. So he explains, if you take this medrash at face value and you say that every single blade of grass has its own particular angel which is helping it grow, vadaya kavana pshuta di'itle hashkacha alav. So certainly it means, what does it mean that there is an influence from above? It means that there is some kind of providence that's making sure that every single thing that occurs in this world is happening the way it's supposed to happen. And certainly all of the other animals, and of course, all of the actions of people. Now, this gives a completely different feel. Now, part of the reason for this, specifically in the Hasidic world, is the idea, because the notion of immanence, of God being involved very, very deeply in what goes on in this world. So that is something which is and perhaps as well the idea of the notion of tikkun, the notion of how this world is a fractured world. It's a world that requires it requires us to make changes and to impact on it positively. And so therefore there is this constant involvement of God in this world. So that's part of it, if you will, from a philosophical level. It is here it has, if you will, the inverse of the pros and cons that I mentioned before. Everything that happens, so whether it's good or bad, you have this sense that God is involved with you. So that is wonderful. The sense of really being close to the Ribono Shel Olam in that regard. The problem with it arises that of course, then it makes the problem of evil in this world all the harsher. Whereas if God is involved in every single thing that's going on, so when we see things that are so terrible, right, how could God let that happen? In the previous way, at worst that you could say is how could, I just saw an incredible YouTube video, which I recommend. You can go online. It's on the Har Etzion site. It's a dialogue. It was a book launch of Rav Amital's 35 years ago or so, and it was a dialogue of Eli Wiesel, Zichrono Livracha, together with Rav Amital, a very, very powerful half hour, and in there this question of trying to grapple with the Shoah was the focus of it, and their joint approach was that we can ask all the questions, but we know there will never be an answer to it. But the worst that you could say from the perspective of the Ribono Shel Olam, which is pretty bad, is how could you see it and not stop it? That is the question. If God is involved in every minute detail, so then God is involved in a way. So, and then the question of Bechira Chofshit and people's impact on that becomes an issue. So this is the counter to the Rambam and the Ramban. I've already gone over, we started late, but the question with, as I said, it was written, this particular tshuva was written in 1976. So he says what the Sefer HaChinuch said, that it's inconceivable that God has all of these details at his fingertips to be able to do it and to have hashgacha. So he says why is it inconceivable? Because he begins and he talks about here in the second paragraph, Bizman hazeh sheyeshnam computers, the radar, the radio stations. Okay. He talks about how so much is, remember he's talking about in 1976, before even the PC has been invented, that basically you have so much that details that can be covered in ways that human beings can't begin to really be able to handle. So why can't, he even calls imkein kol shechen the computer shel borei olam, right? He calls it, right, in the divine computer of God. So why can't it happen? So this was almost 50 years ago. So today, we would say not the computer, but we would say the algorithm of God. So in that algorithm, everything can work. So it's food for thought in terms of the idea, in terms of the Ribono Shel Olam being involved, in terms of one factor, which perhaps I'll talk about at a later time, which I mentioned, but it really requires further elucidation. And what role do we give the Bechira Chofshit in all of this? So that will leave for a different time. But just to go back to the beginning here, these parshiot that we're reading now, and we talk about it all the time, how this is part of the divine plan, and the Torah makes it clear that it's part of the divine plan, but it really requires a great deal of thought as to what it means that there is a divine plan, and how are we and the world as a whole expected to be functioning both as part of a natural order and also at the same time hoping and praying that we have the zchut to receive the hashgacha pratit. Okay, it was I'm still looking able to give the shir in person and in seeing you all in person. All right, take care.
Toda rabba. Bye.
Okay. Oh, there was a request for the Daf Makorot. There was I think it was sent out. I don't know. I'll ask again to be emailed to you. It came to Torah Mitzion, I think, minutes after yesterday's reminder was sent. Have it, but I'll ask them to send it out again. All right.
Thanks.
Take care.
Thank you.